Okay, let's get started. Good morning to you. This is the BayCAN webinar for August 2020. We hope you all are staying safe and healthy as much as you can, and your families and your colleagues and friends as well. These are, as we say each time, extraordinary times, and even more extraordinary than the last time we talked with you. So good morning, and thanks for giving us your time today. We're slated to go from 10:30 until noon. We have a great agenda. So I'm Bruce Reardon. I'm the director of BayCAN, the Bay Area Climate Adaptation Network, and today's webinar is Aligning Adaptation Planning Processes, General Plans, Local Coastal Programs, Local Hazard Mitigation Plans, Climate Action Plans. You name a plan, we've got it. We've had a number of questions raised about how efficient this all is, or how can we be more effective with all of these different adaptation planning processes. And a number of our members in BayCAN have raised questions about how to align or smooth or streamline this process, that it may be taking too much staff time and resources for a number of separate plans. It may be confusing to the public, difficult to engage the public if we have one year we have a local hazard mitigation plan, and the next time we have general plan, and the next time we have something else. We could be using different data sets in different plans because maybe the requirements of them are different. You might be confusing your elected officials too as to which of these plans is really paramount, which one are we doing today. So remember, our BayCAN motto is basically lean and mean. So what we're going to do again today is we found some talented and experienced people, and we're going to give them the mic so they can talk to you about lessons learned, about things they're trying. No one has all the answers for this. We know that, but we have some people that have some pieces of the answer, and we have people that are at different stages of the process. Some have gone through it, some are just starting and thinking about it. So we have some terrific panelists. You can see their names on the screen. We've asked them to do mini presentations so that we can get a lot of information in a short bit of time. We encourage you to use the chat function while we're going to discuss or to ask questions and to pose questions, because after we do the presentations, which will take a little under an hour, we'll have about 30 minutes for a general discussion, and we can get to your questions then. The other thing we can do is we can link you through the chat box with email addresses and all with some of the presenters as you see a need, so that you can hook up with them after the webinar. So with that, let's get going. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for muting your audio devices, and we'll get started with our first presentation. And our first presenter, mini presenter, is going to be Mindy Craig, principal and owner of Blue Point Planning. I will stop sharing my screen, Mindy.
Great.
You can start sharing yours. Mindy and I have been talking about this issue for a few months. She's going to present some interesting ideas about maybe creating a hierarchy of plans. And she's also going to talk to us a little about survey findings, that they've done some surveying recently. So Mindy, if you can turn your camera on, and the floor is yours.
Great, thanks. Hi, welcome everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces here. So for those who don't know me, I work in policy and physical planning throughout California and beyond. I've done tons of work on both energy efficiency, zero net energy, and climate, both on adaptation and on mitigation sides. And almost 100% with government, so state, regional, and local government. And one of the things that is really important to me is how do we create plans that have a foundation based off both on community values and goals that can be implemented. And so the goals question, when I saw Bruce's post some time ago about how to do this, I'm like, yes, this is something that's so important to me, is how do we make sure we're all stepping together to get the right goals so we can actually implement this change. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've been working on, and I hopefully don't talk too fast. Certainly chat me, or if anybody needs me to slow down, let me know. So this is actually a graphic that I worked on with Dana Breckwall when we were working with FEMA and EPA on developing the regional resilience toolkit, or building regional resilience toolkit. To kind of figure out what are all these plans that are being created and how do we understand the hierarchy of those. And from my understanding, there are basically, most communities have sort of guiding or overarching plans, and the general plan is a big one. Sometimes you get council strategic plans. The local hazard mitigation plan is really important and becomes one of those hierarchies. Then you have the secondary set of plans that are supposed to link to those dark blue ones. And that's where our climate adaptation, our action plans, sustainability plans, parks and recreation, all should be connected. And then we have these short-term implementation plans that should also ultimately link up there. So our annual budgets, capital improvement programs, building codes, environmental permitting, they should all be linked. So we should be able to look to any community and have this lovely hierarchy that's really clear and all aligned. That's my vision, at least. And what really actually should happen, unfortunately, as we all know, all these different plans happen in different departments. There's different staff involved, there's different stakeholders involved. So more often than not, that doesn't really happen. But why are goals so important? And this is, again, another graphic we did when we were doing that building regional resilience, which is we want to always start with existing goals. We don't want to start new. We want to understand where the community is and make sure that we connect those goals to what's happening in the physical world, the assets or the hazards, and develop specific goals, especially when we're doing adaptation planning and resilience goals that are connected to what we're already doing. And then as we move forward, use those as a touch point and part of our criteria for whether or not that really is a priority or one of the projects we want to pursue. So there is this idea that there's a continuum and a theme that should be visible in what we're doing. So I work with a lot of different agencies. One of the groups I work with a lot is the Bay Area Regional Energy Network. And so for them, one of the challenges they do energy efficiency programs throughout the 9 Bay Area counties, is how do they get more energy efficiency engagement with the counties with climate action planning. And so I worked with an intern all this summer to look at all of the goals for general plans, for their sustainability plans, their climate action plans, and anything else we could find in the 9 Bay Area counties. She worked really hard, and I have a very in-depth now Excel spreadsheet of all of these different goals. We wanted to figure out what is actually there. What are people doing? Are there alignments? Where are the themes? Where are the connection places? So what we found, there's a lot of old plans out there. A lot of people have general plans that were done in 2008. The world has changed so dramatically since 2008, and yet that is one of those top hierarchy overarching plans. Communities are not keeping these up to date, and I think Michael McCormick is one of my speakers here, and he can speak to this working with OPR, which is there's all these requirements around the general plans that have made it so cumbersome that many communities are afraid, if not just not wanting to touch those general plans. So that hierarchy gets broken down immediately because we have really old plans with old thinking. And the mitigation and adaptation elements that we should be part of that part of our land use and part of our parks and our open space are also often missing. We found that they were not there very often. On the positive side, people who are updating those plans and have recent plans, they're right on the mark. They're really hitting these issues hard in terms of climate, thinking about everything with water and energy. And so there's some really good stuff that people are doing very well, but it's just not connected to what is actually driving policy. And there's a problem. There's little connection between these things. And that, I think, is where we're having a lot of confusion and a lot of issues in terms of actually getting some traction. So this is a really kind of loud slide, but what this is what I found in all those plans. What were the words that came out often across the 9 Bay Area counties? So the dark blue ones, energy and electric, parks and open space, and water, were found throughout. Almost every jurisdiction had those as big goal areas that were really important. Carbon and greenhouse gases, housing, transportation were also there. But I'm going to tell you, adaptation, fire, flooding were really low. There weren't that many. They were very few and far between. And so when I'm thinking about how we engage our jurisdictions and how we actually start to unite them, I look at this and think, what are the things that are actually resonating with jurisdictions? And what are we trying to do as adaptation and climate planners? I really want us to think about this and these goals as a way to connect our stories. We're telling an adaptation story, but if people aren't thinking about that, we may be falling flat. So this idea of connecting and aligning, to me, is understanding what people are saying and what they're connecting to, and then creating those elements much more closely. So its goals have to connect to needs, and they have to connect to the actions. And we have this opportunity to tell some stories and engage better on this if we can do this. If we're missing that and we're continuing to work in our silos, we lose out. And I know that you guys all believe this because you're all here, and Bruce's idea of aligning this is exactly why we're here. So I'm speaking to the choir. But here's some sort of big questions that I want to pose to the group as we are listening to folks throughout today. One, do we have decision makers actively engaging here? And are they buying into this? What are you doing to make sure that they're there? If they have strategic plan goals that aren't in your climate action plan or your climate adaptation plan, we're missing. And they very often are leaving it to staff and aren't engaging. And when we do have goals, are they really in alignment with our current needs? So, you know, are we timely? Are we relevant? And how do we stay relevant? How do we undertake these huge general plans that are 20 to 30-year documents and be relevant? This is a really big question to me. How do we bring community members into this? And I think the underlying thing is, how do we do this equitably? You know, that has been a huge issue here in terms of having equitable engagement that really thinks about this in a different way. And one of the things I'm going to put out there as a really big idea, is there a better way by creating just one plan? What if we just had a climate action plan that was also our general plan, that was also our adaptation plan? You know, Contra Costa County is just about to do their general plan, and they are doing it with the climate action plan. These things are not separate. They are one and the same. And then what can we make this action focused? How can we actually not just have big ideas and big thoughts, but things that actually get done and implemented? Because as we all know, our state is burning up and we need to do things quickly and more rapidly than we ever did before. So I'm going to stop there because I think that everyone has lots to say, and then we can come back and I have a couple other elements if people want to dig more into these goals to show how that works, but I want to make sure we have time for everybody else. Does that sound good, Bruce?
That sounds perfect. And thank you, Mindy. Great way to lead off by framing this in an interesting way. I encourage you again, folks, to chat Mindy up here in the chat function as we're going. And we will get to those questions that Mindy posed. There's some really good ones there when we get to the big discussion after we have our other mini presentations. So if you would stop sharing your screen, which it looks like you have, and I will share mine back. Hold on. Our next presenter is going to be Leanne Singleton from Hermosa Beach. And Leanne is, hold on a second. Go on, Leanne, where are you? Here we are. And Leanne Singleton couldn't be with us today from Hermosa Beach, so we recorded this, as you'll see, just the other day. They started on this idea of combining plans quite a while back and have extended it over the last couple of years. So let me blow up the screen here a little bit and let's see what Leanne has to say. So we're here talking today. Excuse me for just a second. We're going to do this again because we've got to get the sound right. Share computer sound and Leanne. And we'll try it again here. With Leanne Singleton, who's the environmental analyst for the city of Hermosa Beach. Hello, Leanne.
Hello.
So can you tell us, we know you've done some work around aligning some different climate adaptation planning processes. Why did Hermosa Beach do this? Can you tell us a little bit of that? And then what did you do?
Sure. So thanks for having me today. I'll share a little bit about the story of Hermosa Beach and how we undertook updating a number of our long-range plans for the city. For those that are not familiar, Hermosa Beach, very small city in LA County along the Santa Monica Bay. We're 1.4 square miles. And about half of our city is located within the coastal zone. So we have not only a general plan that we need to adhere to, but we also have the Coastal Act and our local coastal program. For the city of Hermosa Beach, we had not updated our general plan comprehensively in over 30 years when we initiated this back in 2012. And while we have a certified land use plan from the Coastal Commission, we do not have coastal jurisdiction and have not obtained certification of our local coastal program as a whole. And so with half of the city located in the coastal zone, our efforts back in 2012 and 2013 really focused on integrating those two documents and really focusing on kind of the topics of climate change, sea level rise, extreme heat. What are the things that we expect to see over the next 30 years? And start to plan for that. So our update efforts were initiated prior to some of the more recent legislation like SB 379, but really the idea of incorporating and integrating both the general plan and the coastal plan, as well as keeping an eye on how we address climate change and sea level rise within those plans was really kind of the starting point. From there, in 2017, we initiated an update to our local hazard mitigation plan. And what was helpful for us is that a lot of the technical studies, the vulnerability assessments that were conducted as part of the general plan update helped very nicely transition and address in a cohesive format our hazard mitigation plan, as it relies on many of those same studies.
Did this come from you, or did someone in your city bureaucracy say, hey, we've got to have fewer plans, or we've got to build on plans, or something like that?
You know, the initiation of the general plan predates myself, but it was really, a small city and a small team. Seems like a big task to take on, but a bigger task is trying to manage and administer multiple plans with sometimes different updates, different information, conflicting information. And so it really was the vision of our community development department back in 2012 and 2013 was to focus on incorporating and integrating the two documents together at one time.
Great, thanks. And so tell us a little more about how you did this and kind of for our group here, maybe what worked in that process.
Absolutely. So for our general plan and coastal plan, we really looked at what are the required elements of a general plan, and then what are the requirements of the Coastal Act, and really at the beginning of this process, mapped out where there was overlap, how different things were addressed. We really did rely on the general plan required elements structure primarily, but we've noted throughout the document where public access, for example, has been addressed, or where scenic and visual resources or coastal hazards are addressed. And sometimes they're addressed in multiple chapters. And certainly climate mitigation and adaptation plays a role in almost every element of the general plan that we've developed. And so that was kind of our foundation. And then we looked at the different tools that were out there to help us address that. So the state agency documents that are out there, the different funding opportunities, that really did play a role, where about half of our update process was funded through different granting organizations. And then relying on studies and organizations down here in the LA area where the research and the science is being done.
You talked about grants for the process. I'm sure that'll interest our people. Where did you get grants and how hard was that to do?
So we were able to, a big part of laying out that kind of master plan was really to identify what studies could be funded through different granting agencies, what policies could be implemented in different ways. And so we were fortunate to receive a grant from the Strategic Growth Council, which covered a big chunk of the general plan update process. We also received grants from the Coastal Commission and the Coastal Conservancy that helped fund some of the technical studies, the vulnerability assessments. We did a dedicated vulnerability assessment just for our infrastructure. That was funded through the Coastal Conservancy, and then with the hazard mitigation planning, that was through a grant from FEMA.
So in the end of this, or in the process of this, you didn't end up with one plan. You ended up with the individual plans, but they were more aligned or built on each other. Is that fair?
We ended up with two plans. So we have our hazard mitigation plan, and we have our integrated general plan and coastal land use plan, which we refer to as Plan Hermosa.
So give us some maybe practical examples for our group of people that are starting out. What things worked for you, or how did this become a pretty good success for you?
Absolutely. So I'll talk a little bit about maybe the technical studies that were done as part of this. We really focused in terms of the hazards that we looked at in identifying those hazards that exist today, and then layered onto that, how might those change in frequency, severity, intensity in the future with climate change. And we looked at those as a way kind of thinking about what does that hazard look like today? How might that change? That they may increase over time, and really planning ahead for that, thinking about the values or the coastal access components. So we structured a lot of our analysis of physical vulnerabilities around our public access facilities, so things like the coastal trail, our access road, our parking. We looked at our recreational facilities. Recreation and our visitor serving uses are really the main attraction to our small coastal community. And then we looked at our infrastructure system. So we really tried to structure it around key components of the Coastal Act in terms of our vulnerabilities. One of the other things I like to talk a lot about is typically how we communicate risks. So really thinking about lessons learned for those as they're getting started. There is so much information and data out there, and knowing what data to use, what terminology works best, what units of measurement, there's so much out there that my tips to folks are often pick a set and stick with it. I can't tell you how many times where we were projecting, we were talking about what does 55 inches of sea level rise look like, and then in another study we would talk about 150 centimeters, and all of a sudden we're predicting 150 inches of sea level rise, which has a very different impact than what we're actually trying to project. And so sticking with those and then considering the level of specificity, obviously, I refer to it sometimes as planner math. It's the how detailed do we need to get, and by looking at things in decimal points can often lead people to think that that is a very specific and very determined number that might be used. So my advice to folks is pick the terminology, the units of measurement, your data methods, and your data sources, and really stick with those throughout your process. That's one of the lessons learned, I think, for sure, that we've had through this process.
If you could do one thing differently next time, or maybe two, what would you do differently?
That's a great question. I think the sticking with the consistency was a big part of the challenges that we've had with folks being confused about it. I think thinking through what the range of options are and recognizing that there are certain options for mitigation of, say, sea level rise that are appropriate right now, and certain options that could be implemented in the future if others are not successful. I know the idea of managed retreat is often a controversial topic, but that's something that, you know, we have a wide sandy shoreline. We don't have any bluffs, we don't have any cliffs, but that's something we could look at in the longer term future. But we have a lot of things that can be done between now and then. And I think sometimes folks get scared of some of the more extreme measures that may need to be taken if others are not successful. And so kind of framing that for folks is another lesson learned or a thing I would do differently.
Well, thanks. And thanks for your quick summary here of what you did. Where can we find the documents, the plans themselves?
Sure. So for the city of Hermosa Beach, our website does include all of our different planning documents. We've got a library of different documents that we've prepared. So that's hermosabeach.gov. Search for Plan Hermosa in there, and it'll bring up both our general plan as well as our hazard mitigation plan, since that was incorporated by reference to meet some of the state requirements for the streamlining of those documents there. We also, earlier this year, post general plan, implemented a program that does visualizations of what sea level rise might look like. And so that those materials can be found at hermosabeach.gov/look ahead. And that's another place where sea level rise documentation videos that show what it might look like and what some of the mitigation options are is available on our website as well.
Well, thank you, Leanne. Thanks for taking the time with us, and congratulations on getting through this interesting process with Hermosa Beach.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Okay. Okay, so that's Leanne Singleton. She obviously can answer questions in the chat. This was recorded earlier this week, but please, I will put her email address. If you want to contact her directly, I'll put it in the chat function in a little bit. Okay, next up is Hillary Papendick from San Mateo County. Hillary, I will stop sharing. I have stopped sharing, so you can share now your screen. San Mateo County is, in Hillary's words, somewhat at the beginning of this process. So they're looking at a couple of different options and of ways to go. Again, we said earlier, everybody doesn't have this figured out, but let's hear from Hillary. The floor is yours.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay, terrific. Thanks. Yeah, when Bruce asked me to talk through this, I said, no, we're not ready. But he thought it might be helpful for us to just talk through what we have done so far and what we're thinking about how to approach kind of trying to combine and align planning processes that we have underway at San Mateo County. So we've been working, a team of us has been working on this kind of since the spring. There's a number of team members in Office of Sustainability, and then we've been working with Planning and Office of Emergency Services at the county. So I thought I would go through kind of what plans we have underway, kind of the context for this work, and then what we're thinking in terms of our approach, and then some questions that we have. I'm learning a lot so far, hearing the two presentations, and I'm hoping that this is an opportunity for us to get some feedback and thoughts from others too. So some of the plans that we have underway, we're currently doing our community climate action plan, and we started to think about how to incorporate adaptation into the climate action plan for the unincorporated area. And this brought up the discussion of what scale should we be doing an adaptation plan for the county. The thought was, rather than do just unincorporated climate action plan, we have the opportunity to do a county-wide climate adaptation plan. And this actually led us to start talking about what other planning processes we have underway. So our local hazard mitigation plan was last completed in July of 2016, and it's now due for an update. It was almost countywide last time. It was 18 cities and the county. And this time the county has secured grant funds and all 20 cities have provided letters of support. So the plan is to do a countywide local hazard mitigation plan update that's led by our Office of Emergency Services. And we're also planning on updating our safety element to meet SB 379 requirements, as well as some other requirements since our safety element hasn't been updated since the 80s, which could definitely relate to the fact that it's challenging to update general plans, and some of our elements it's been quite some time since they've been updated. So next I wanted to give some context of where this work fits into. For a number of years, the county has been working on really trying to understand the risk and starting to plan and prepare for climate impacts in the county. So I think as many of you are aware, we completed a vulnerability assessment for sea level rise in 2018. And this was almost the whole county except the South Coast. And we're just completing the South Coast assessment now. And then over the past 2 years or so, we received funding from Caltrans to downscale climate risks on heat, wildfire, inland flooding, and develop a viewer to really understand what this looks like and overlap with vulnerable communities and our transportation systems, as well as other critical facilities. So we have this information at a countywide scale, and really sets us up to do countywide planning and develop the actions and strategies at a multi-jurisdictional scale. We also spent the last 1.5 years working with our climate collaborative to do learning sessions around these risks and really hear from community members, businesses, nonprofits, and others about what their needs are. So I just wanted to give that background in terms of what context we're working in. We've really invested a lot in trying to understand what the risks are countywide. So we want to transition that to doing countywide planning work. So this is a graphic that Isabel in our office has put together to try to understand these different efforts and how we're thinking about them. So we've had a number of discussions about how we set the stage for adaptation planning and adaptation goals in a way that integrates with the hazard mitigation plan and the safety element. And some of the options that we've been thinking about is do we even need a framework or a strategy that's separate from the hazard mitigation plan on adaptation? And we really want to have this effort be is driven by community members and community goals as possible. And given that goal, we also want to be as comprehensive as possible in how we're addressing climate impacts and adaptation. So looking at impacts that go beyond some of the hazards that are required in the hazard mitigation plan, like ecosystems and agriculture and health. So this has led us to the thought of creating a climate resiliency framework or a climate resiliency strategy. It's called a plan in this slide, that would set up the goals and the structure for how, and the strategies for addressing adaptation that would then feed into the hazard mitigation plan and the safety element. And we have a little bit of lead time on the hazard mitigation plan. The Office of Emergency Services is just accepting the grant, I think, of the next board meeting, and then they'll be releasing an RFP in December or January. So our thought is to front load the climate resiliency strategy work and set up an equitable process and framework for partnerships with community members, which can then feed into these other efforts. And we also have been talking with Office of Emergency Services about having the Office of Sustainability lead the outreach piece of the hazard mitigation plan as well. So one of our main concerns is just the confusion with working with community members about like, wait, now we're doing a separate plan and we're coming up with strategies again. So we want these to be seamless in terms of when we reach out to the community members, it can be seen almost one planning process, but first we're setting up a framework and then the strategies will go into these plans. So we're just talking today with planning about this approach, and then we'll loop back with Office of Emergency Services and kind of set up some of the structure behind how we do the cross-departmental collaboration. So one thing I thought I would talk through are some of our ideas about how to have the strongest equity approach possible. We're talking about doing some pre-planning consultation with CBOs where we develop some small contracts and help provide some compensation for helping us think through what our stakeholder structure looks like. And then as part of the plan, we're planning on hiring a consultant for this work. So we also want to have contracts with CBOs to help us assist with the working with community members and others. We also recognize how it's challenging even for staff in our office, or even me. It's taken me a while to understand what all these are. So taking the time to really do some capacity building and education around what is involved in these efforts and what does this mean for outcomes on the ground in the community. So we've been kind of sketching out and just starting to talk through what a committee structure might look like with both community members, CBOs, decision makers at the table, working throughout the whole process. The county currently has a recovery initiative underway where they've designed several committees that are overseen by an equity committee, and members of the equity committee are in all of the other committees. So we're using that process to help us guide how we're thinking about this, but we're still definitely open for suggestions. And we've heard through our Climate Ready Collaborative that community members and others are ready to kind of see some of the fruits of the plans. So we're thinking about setting aside some funds to work on some implementation projects concurrently that could help with wildfire and recovery work and heat and some of these things that are very acutely felt in the community right now. So I just thought I would go over some of the questions that we're grappling with in case others have thoughts to help us with these. So one of the things that we're really trying to figure out is how to best integrate the outreach and engagement. So I mentioned we're going to integrate them, but like, what does this actually look like, and how can we do it in a way that feels fairly seamless for community members? And then how to best partner with community members on these processes. I think it feels challenging sometimes to have this be community driven when the plans are driven by state legislation and there's certain things that are already constrained. So we're trying to be really upfront with what the constraints are here, with also wanting to give as much leadership and ownership of the plans to community groups as well. And we're also concerned about the capacity of community groups who are, right now helping people who've been evacuated and who are affected by COVID. And then the other piece that maybe I didn't touch on this quite enough is we're about to reach out to our cities and ask if they want to be a part of the resilience strategy. We already know they're signed on to the hazard mitigation plan, but do they want to also be part of a countywide resilience strategy? And it's from our experience with the civil rights vulnerability assessment, it's quite a bit of work just to collaborate with all the cities, and then we're laying on overlays of working with our community partners and businesses and others. So what's the best structure to do that effectively? And then we're putting together a scope of work. We're wondering, like, what are some of the skill set for a strong consultant team, and then how much budget is needed for the plan and then for community partnerships. So I thought our office team in our office has done some research on other examples. I thought I'd throw these up there in case other people haven't seen these, in addition to everyone who's presenting today on the panel. And that's all I have. Happy to answer questions and take feedback or suggestions.
Thank you, Hillary. And if I could ask you and Mindy also to put the questions from your question slides in the chat function. That'll be an easy way for us to save them. And we'll get to some of those, hopefully, in the big discussion after the presentation. So thank you, Hillary. Thanks for sharing when you're at somewhat near the beginning of this process. Very, very helpful for us to hear. Okay, our next presenter. Oh, before we get to our next presenter, we had a question in the chat about the slide decks. Yes, the slides will be available, but also the recording. We're recording the entire webinar, and the entire recording, so you get audio and video, will be there. Dana Brickwald is up next. Dana, if you're gonna use slides, share your screen, please. Dana has done a lot of work with local hazard mitigation plans, both at ABAG, where she was originally when I knew her, I think quite a few years ago now, Dana, and then now at BCDC. And she wants to talk to us about focusing kind of in on local hazard mitigation plans as part of this alignment process. So Dana, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Bruce. I actually do not have slides, so I don't know about you all, but I'm like Zoom and slided out. So I'm just going to talk at you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience that was previously focused on LHMPs, as he mentioned, but also how you integrate adaptation effectively into LHMPs, and then work that we're doing now at BCDC that continues this concept. So just to go over my experience in aligning planning processes to include adaptation, in 2011, ABAG had created a regional local hazard mitigation plan that many cities annexed onto. But leading up to the expiration of this plan, we wanted to design a process that would help cities prepare their own local hazard mitigation plans rather than annex onto a regional plan. But also, we wanted to design this process to not just include past and current hazards, which is what the requirement is, but what we called future hazards, so hazards that had no precedent, like wildfire and sea level rise flooding, and that had no real precedent for how to do that. So in that effort, which was in around 2015, we led 9 workshops around the region that really emphasized how do you do a comprehensive risk assessment that involves more robust community engagement, and how do you actually plan for good strategies that lead to implementation. So we developed a lot of materials such as a sample outline for an LHMP that we knew met FEMA requirements, but would go above and beyond to look at future hazards. So this led to a session at the 2015 APA conference where we laid out this process, and then this consequently led to the Regional Resilience Toolkit with EPA, FEMA, and Mindy, which she mentioned before. And really the overarching theme in all of these projects is that if you know how to do a single, flexible, comprehensive vulnerability assessment that includes really robust community outreach, you can use this information in many ways, including the local hazard mitigation plan, including an adaptation plan, whatever suite of plans you decide to do, where you decide to embed this information. Once you've done this process once, that material can be used many different ways. The challenge here is making sure that your assessment meets the requirements of everything that is mandated, such as the LHMP SB 379. So when we were developing this material, we really poured over all of these requirements to make sure that the process that we developed covered all of those issues. So my current role is as the Adapting to Rising Tides Program Manager at BCDC, and we're working on a few projects there that are relevant to this topic area. So the first one is detailing a more robust process for moving from vulnerability assessment to implementation of adaptation strategies. So really ensuring that that guidance is more well documented, and that includes the conversation of where can you take this information, where can you insert it into your local planning documents. And Jackie Mandowski is the lead of that project, and I believe she's on the call here. And another project we're working on is assessing the current state of adaptation planning in the region, which involves tracking local LHMPs to see if they actually do include adaptation and future flooding and climate change issues, but also trying to poke around and see what the current compliance with SB 379 is. And Karen Tanner, who I believe is also on this call, is leading that project. So out of my experiences with these projects, I saw some themes over and over that sort of highlight some of the challenges in this process. The first one is really fear about how can you get a local hazard mitigation plan approved easily if it's not formulaic. So we did work with a few cities and counties during that time who deviated a little bit from the FEMA Local Planning Mitigation Handbook. For those of you who are familiar, there is a really formulaic checklist that allows you to get your LHMP approved. And some of these people actually did have some challenges getting their plans approved by Cal OES on their first try. Cal OES uses a checklist to review their plans to make sure that they conform to FEMA's requirements. So it takes some creativity to make sure that a plan clearly meets the minimum requirements and is in a format that Cal OES can recognize, but isn't limited by that checklist or by that format. And I think, you know, since this process, I think Cal OES has spent a lot more time learning how to do this a bit better. They've taken on more adaptation tasks, so hopefully this continues to improve in the future. But one of the challenges here also is that the guidelines that FEMA uses for local hazard mitigation plans are national, so they don't necessarily account for the needs of areas like the Bay Area, and they're also outdated. They were last updated in 2013, so they don't necessarily keep up with current needs. Another issue was lack of guidance or good precedents. So obviously, you know, webinars like today are sharing where the good precedents actually are. But this was really a huge one. So even when cities did include sea level rise or other climate hazards in their local hazard mitigation plan, there was really no real guidance on how to do it consistently or do it well. So people were choosing wildly different sea level rise projections, can really influence how effective your plan actually is. Leanne mentioned that even internally, they were talking about sea level rise projections in different ways. And we saw that with local hazard mitigation plans, but we're also seeing it now as people really struggle to understand how to conform with SB 379. People have really varying impressions of what meets SB 379 requirements and what doesn't, especially because there's no checklist for like there is for LHMPs, which I just mentioned how unhelpful those checklists are, but in a way they actually are helpful as well. And I think that we've seen some real missed opportunities. I've seen people do really great work, but they weren't sure what requirements it actually met. So they missed out on an opportunity to have credit for their work. And I've also seen some work that was maybe not the highest quality that actually did conform and did pass requirements. And so there's a real inconsistency there. And then the last one is the local capacity to do this type of planning. One thing that came up a lot when we were running these workshops and that I've heard since is whether cities have the capacity to do it themselves or whether they should hire a consultant. Our stance was always that we are encouraging people to build the capacity to do this type of work internally, primarily because it's the best way to build intimacy with the content of the plans, which is what creates true buy-in for implementing the strategies, and also really sets the jurisdiction up for more meaningful community engagement. Local hazard mitigation plans need to be updated every 5 years. So between updating the plan and implementing the plan, there's really constant work to be done. And then there are all these other plans as well that need to be updated and done. So I feel like there's full-time work here for sure. However, it's no secret that the quality of the plans done by consultants is typically higher. This is what they do all the time. They have a formula for it. You know, they know how to do this process. The other thing is if you get a FEMA planning grant, it's much easier to use that lump sum to hire a consultant than to hire a full-time staff person. But even though you have a better plan, possibly you still have the same issues here that maybe local staff is not deeply engaged in the planning process, is not bought into implementation, and there can be real issues with community engagement if an outside consultant comes in that doesn't know the community and doesn't have the trust there for community engagement. Another issue that we saw is really which department leads this type of planning. So I think Hillary just spoke to this a bit. It really needs to be multidisciplinary. And what we saw with local hazard mitigation plans a lot is that the emergency response division does it. And though there are some really great people in those departments around the region, it really does need to be led by a more multidisciplinary team. So the last point that I will make is a current project that we're working on is called BayAdapt at BCDC. And in this process, in the BayAdapt process, we're talking about how to better support this type of work. So how do you pull together guidance, set standards region-wide for data and science, and help build capacity for local adaptation planning in cities and counties. And we actually just had a great working group meeting yesterday where we started to brainstorm ideas on how to build, for example, a data science and technical assistance consortium, which could really help to bring a lot of these ideas along. There's also a group that talked about how the region helps to support internal plan alignment. So we're spending a lot of time working on these issues right now. So I think this webinar today is really timely and hopefully will feed into the solutions that we develop for the BayAdapt process as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dana. Lots of great info. And again, chat up Dana in the chat box if you want, and then we'll get to her again when we get to the discussion period. So next up is Tiffany Wise-West. Some of you know Tiffany from City of Santa Cruz. They're in the middle of this process. Tiffany, we're running a little behind on schedule. If in, let's say, 5 or 6 minutes, if you could give us maybe some of the lessons, a couple of the key lessons learned so far that you've had and kind of where you are in the City of Santa Cruz attempt to align these things. So Tiffany, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Bruce. And it's really nice to be with all of you again. Can you see my screen?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So I just have one slide to share with you all, and it kind of takes us through, starting in the upper left-hand corner. The city did develop its local hazard mitigation plan and climate adaptation plan together, back starting at the end of 2016, and it finally got adopted in 2018. And what was, I'd say, some of the successful elements of that kind of combining those processes together is that, number one, we had a combined planning team for both the LHMP and the adaptation plan update. We had separate project managers, but we worked very closely together. I managed the adaptation plan update. Now, in the contents of the LHMP, after every hazard, there was a brief description of future projections and climate adaptation considerations. But I think the best thing that we did is that our climate adaptation plan and all of its appendices are an appendix to the LHMP. So they actually are part of that plan. So while the measures in the LHMP are slightly different from the adaptation plan, coming from kind of different perspective, because the adaptation plan is an appendix to the LHMP, those measures are also eligible for pre and post hazard mitigation funding. So that was a good choice that we made. However, we do experience the same kinds of challenges that have already been articulated, that siloing of implementation of the LHMP from the adaptation plan, but we are making strides to integrate that work. I'm kind of sharing also not just the LHMP and the adaptation plan, but a series of other interconnected and hopefully aligned processes. So once we finished the LHMP and the CAP update in 2018, we did in 2019 incorporate the LHMP by reference into our general plan safety element. So that was via an ordinance. It was a very simple thing for us to do. I think many of you on the line know what it takes to get an ordinance through. And then that led to, you know, being called our Westcliff Drive Adaptation and Management Plan and our LCP update project, which I know I've been in front of this group before and talked about. Those were two high priority projects that came out of our climate adaptation plan project process. And those will be done at the end of 2020. But I thought what might be interesting is what we've revealed as two other plans that require alignment with this effort. So what you see in the last circle is coming out of our LCP update is very likely going to be more plans that are going to be required to specify more detail than the the LCP will specify in terms of project-based work, so near-term project-based work. So it's very likely this is not final. We're right in the midst of deciding this with the Coastal Commission and our consultants, but it's very likely we will have an overarching beaches plan, a coastal armory management plan, and potentially sub-area plans for our coastline that contains the monitoring and triggers program, because it's looking like that may not be appropriate in the LCP. I'm going to share with you one other thing is that after the LCP amendment is complete in December, we will have to go back and amend our general plan, which we will likely do in 2025. There are also area plans, specific plans, and access plans that will likely need to be aligned with that LCP update. Of course, by 2023, our 5-year update of the LHMP and the Climate Adaptation Plan will also take place. So we will, again, refine. As Dana said, this is like, you know, I just realized this really is a full-time job. I mean, there is a lot of next step stuff. Also, some revisions to design guidelines and the LCP's implementation regulations. So really, this is, you know, as we kind of continue to do this work, I think there's that continual alignment that needs to happen between these plans. And now that we're kind of, you know, through the LHMP, the CAP update, the general plan, and some next step projects, we're kind of seeing what's coming next. So I guess the last thing that I'll say is that, you know, as you all, I've presented before, we've been doing a lot of work around equity and really experimenting with our engagement. And I really appreciate where Hillary's coming from. That planning from the start, I think is, I've often found myself kind of making it up as I go along. And so I love the prompts that Hillary had shared. And lastly, on recovery, our recovery team has really embraced the resiliency aspect and really wants these implementation projects that come out of our LCP and our Westcliff Drive plan to pursue grants to get those infrastructure projects, those living shoreline implementation projects moving so that we can provide good green construction jobs in our town. So that is a key facet to our recovery planning right now. And so I'm really looking at the whole range of grants that are open right now. So with that, thank you so much. If you want to see where we're at on Resilient Coast, please check out our website. We do have our Sea Level Rise mobile phone app out now as well.
Great. As always, Tiffany, great stuff. Thank you. We love Santa Cruz and the work you're doing. Let's stay in your general area. Next, we're going to go to Watsonville. We have 2 more presentations. I'm going to ask each of our presenters, like Tiffany did, to stick to 5 or 6 minutes so that we can get to Q&A. Michael McCormick and Carolyn E. Vejes from Harrison Associates have been working with the city of Watsonville. And so, Michael and Carolyn, why don't you introduce yourselves while I'm getting your slide up here. And you have the floor, Michael.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, hi, everybody. It's nice to see so many familiar faces. And Bruce, I sent a slide after this one. I don't know if you can pull that one up. It's a little bit clearer on the diagram without the words on it.
Let's just go with the one we have.
Okay.
I have it up.
So nice to see everybody. I'm Michael McCormick. I'm a Senior Vice President here at Harrison Associates, and Carolyn Vejes, who's a Senior Analyst. And we do a number of our climate adaptation initiatives across Harris. A little background on me from my time at Office of Planning and Research, and have been actively collaborating across the regional collaboratives for years. And so great to be here to talk a little bit about Watsonville. We were a late ad. Had a great call with the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives Climate Adaptation yesterday that kind of spurred our involvement in this. And Jackie McLeod, who has really been spearheading a lot of these efforts at the city, is also on the call today. So really briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the timeline, give it over to Carolyn to talk about the structure, and then hand it to Jackie to cover those things we missed. So we'll be pretty expeditious, each of us. But on the timeline standpoint, Watsonville is interesting. It's not really an affluent community, and I think the process that emerged to develop the integrated approach that you're looking at on the screen came from, it was almost an accidental opportunity on integration. And it came through a process where we first started looking at flood risk and thinking about the community rating system and what the rating for the community is. You can receive additional funding, and if your community is rated less vulnerable. And the conversation resulted in a work on the LHMP, and then work to incorporate climate adaptation and resilience into the LHMP to meet SB 379 requirements. And I think we also talked a little bit about, well, what does this mean from a climate action plan perspective, and wouldn't it make sense to now do a climate action adaptation plan to fold this in addition to an updated safety element? And then with the triggers around SB 1000 on environmental justice, that also kicked into gear, along with the city's really proactive stance on implementation and trying to actually do implementation as they're developing the policy. I've been really impressed working with the city and how they have been doing community engagement through multilingual outreach as well. So it's been a really fun process, and it's almost been accidental that we came to what I would say is probably one of the more ideal structures for addressing adaptation, because it's this wholesale integration that has been that holy grail for so long that we've talked about, all the way from the visioning development to the policy to the implementation measures and the funding as well. So I'm going to hand it off to Carolyn to talk a little bit more about how these things work together, and then Jackie can follow up with some of the specific thoughts from her perspective on the city.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Thanks, everyone. I mean, I think just to emphasize what Michael was saying is that, this is an accidental process, which is really built through natural efficiencies gained through starting with a robust risk assessment and leveraging pre-disaster funding through FEMA to develop a climate vulnerability assessment and embed that in the local hazard mitigation plan. And once, as Dana mentioned earlier, once you have that vulnerability assessment, that really core analysis, you can carry it over quite easily to other planning documents. So, incorporating the climate projections, incorporating the social vulnerability analysis and the risk assessment all in the LHMP. And then when we came to develop the climate action and adaptation, or when the climate action plan was being considered to update, doing that with an adaptation plan that didn't have to repeat that risk assessment gave us an opportunity to really focus on regional and compounding vulnerabilities that a disadvantaged community wants, especially in an agricultural community, wants to focus on. So our adaptation assessment in Watsonville is really interesting. It's focusing on migration and agricultural vulnerabilities, grid reliability issues, things that really impact the community with PSPS events going on, but without having to do a whole other process to do those risk assessment and exposure maps over again. And that was, still through FEMA funding. Everyone I think is familiar with the legislation and requirements that motivated all this, adopting the LHMP through AB 2140 to get the safety element into compliance, coordinating with the environmental justice elements to develop a community advisory committee that can engage both on the EJ elements and the climate action and adaptation plan, I think was a really important and good call for the community to not overburden their public with outreach activities. And one last thing I'll mention before handing it over to Jackie is that I think the role of the consulting firm in that discussion of really who should own these processes, it definitely is a full-time job. I think what Harris's approach is to provide that robust analysis, and the city has done such an amazing job of translating a very complex analysis to the community, and through that community engagement has engaged both with the content and led the engagement efforts to make sure that the community is not only engaged on the topic, but really understanding the results of the analysis that was done through the local hazard mitigation plan. So definitely a lot of overlaps and interplays between these planning efforts. Didn't really touch on the green infrastructure plan, which was kind of an offshoot. But again, the LHMP really allowed us to do the analyses that we could build from to develop competitive grant applications to do other one-off projects. So I'll hand it over to Jackie to kind of fill in the gaps there and highlight anything that she thinks is important through this effort.
Thanks, Carolyn and Michael, and I appreciate the opportunity. I'll keep it very brief. I think where we stand as municipal employees is we want to make sure that when we have these planning efforts, they're not living in a silo so that one is talking to the other. And ultimately, they don't end up on a shelf somewhere where we've checked a box for regulatory and environmental compliance. So we can meet all the legislative requirements in silos, but when we combine those opportunity areas, what we end up with, especially in economically distressed cities, is actual implementation. How are we going to improve these situations for residents who typically cannot get those resources? So as Carolyn was talking about, the Green Infrastructure Plan that is going to be funded through a Bay Area Council grant program will actually take some of the hazardous modeling from our hazard mitigation and risk assessment and look at where we have areas of opportunity to plant trees to provide shade covering for our residents who do work in agricultural fields. We're also leveraging that grant program with an urban forestry grant. So we have this coming together of all these risk assessments, potential challenges to actual implementation. So completing that loop and not just doing it for legislative and sort of regulatory compliance. We actually want to see actual movement in our community towards climate action and adaptation, towards a more resilient community. Both Tiffany and I are kind of in the unique position, as many of you in North Coast are, right, in Northern California. We're in the middle of an active wildfire right now. We are seeing our community being decimated from not making a ton of decisions that allowed us to be resilient, whether that was through active forest management. So I think a lot of these plans and what we're seeing right now on the ground is going to help us move forward to building our communities out. So I think that's it. I know Bruce had asked us to keep it very brief, but I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Jackie. Excellent. And Michael and Carolyn, all three of you, I know we could do an hour on Watsonville, but maybe in the Q&A and then post meeting here. Thank you very much, especially in what we're in the midst of right now today. Okay, last one. And then we'll get to discussion and Q&A. Eric DeCoke from OPR, Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Now, OPR, as you all know, works with cities and counties and the state, all over the state. They probably could do an hour themselves here on this topic. But Eric, if you could give us 5 or 6 minutes, maybe about the adaptation planning guide, the 2.0 that's out and how it maybe approaches this question we have today, and also the compass that you all and some others here worked on. Eric, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Bruce. If I could, I'd like to quickly share my screen just to get the latest version of the APG up for everyone to see.
The screen is yours.
Awesome, hopefully everyone can see that. Adaptation planning guide. So yeah, thank you so much, Bruce. Good to see everyone. Really quickly, I think hopefully a lot of folks have heard this, but the final version of the California Adaptation Planning Guide, a multi-year process to update this 2012 document, was just published in its final published format a few weeks ago. It does say June, but it was literally just, it is pretty hot off the presses in its final format. I will just quickly say you can look at the PDF version. That's what I'm showing on the screen here. Our climate team, led by Nguyen Taraki, our climate resilience deputy director, and Nikki Caravalli, our new planning assistant, are actively embedding this new adaptation planning guide into the adaptation clearinghouse on OPR's website. So you should all look for emails from OPR. Hopefully you're signed up for our listservs. But we'll be engaging statewide some workshops on just how that adaptation planning guide looks and feels in the clearinghouse. We really want folks to test drive it and give us some feedback on how that online version will work. Just really quickly on the content of the adaptation planning guide, just on the subject today of alignment, I just wanted to emphasize that, yes, the concept of integration and alignment is very much encouraged. I think that as folks look through this adaptation planning guide, if you haven't already, there's a lot of work that went into just showing the different uses and contexts for local adaptation planning that the guide provides. There is mention of some of the regulatory requirements for SB 379 for looking at climate adaptation in the general plan safety element, of course, but there's jumping off points as well for looking at other planning mechanisms, whether we're talking about the local hazard mitigation plan, other specific plans that might be included as well, and really how to use those tools to your advantage. And so there's really no prescriptive process for alignment or integration in the adaptation planning guide. It's really more about the planning framework and the opportunities that are really actually threaded throughout all 4 of the major phases of the APG's framework. Whether we're talking about that very early phase 1 of just setting the table for planning, setting the table for understanding what the community's desires and concerns are, what planning mechanisms exist, and then how to tie things together. So there's some really good guidance on just framing early on in the process, as well as the more technical pieces. I heard multiple presenters today talk about how they integrated the vulnerability assessment through the risk analysis in an LHMP and leveraged that to the advantage of the adaptation portion of their planning. So I think that's another great example that's pretty encouraged in the APG. But really, regardless of the choice of what framework or how you choose to embed adaptation strategy and policy and action in your plans, it's really about what framework is best and how to align it and make sure that it's embedded throughout as much of your planning as a local agency as possible, and thinking about regional policy making as well. I mean, there is guidance in the APG about regional collaboration and coordination as well that we really want folks to think about. I think some of the case studies that were presented today are another really great examples of how whole counties and whole regions are beginning to try to align their efforts. I will say really quickly that, there is funding, not as much funding as there was before. I've heard a lot of folks talk about the lack of resources or staffing capacity. The one big game in town right now in this moment is leveraging money for housing planning. The Department of Housing and Community Development is looking very favorably on integrated planning grant applications through the LEAP and REAP programs, the local early action planning and regional early action planning programs. The local early action planning grant deadline is January 2021. So you'll still have plenty of time if you haven't yet applied for your LEAP funds. These are formula over the counter grants. They're non-competitive. So I really encourage folks, if you haven't gotten on the LEAP REAP bandwagon yet, to talk to your fellow planners, folks in other departments, and think through how best to position for some of those funds. We did just put out on the street an integrated guidance document, and I'm happy to drop that in the chat during Q&A with HCD that talks about some of the integration approach options that might be looked on favorably for funding by HCD. So we're trying to help folks come alongside these resources and best leverage funding to that end. The last thing I wanted to cover before we open up for Q&A was the planning compass for sea level rise and adaptation. I'll just quickly hit the back button. I was on the wrong page. So this originally came out in hard copy format. It was a collaborative approach by a number of state and federal agencies, including NOAA, USGS, FEMA at the federal level, at the state agency level, the Coastal Commission, Cal OES, OPR, the Ocean Protection Council, the Coastal Conservancy, and then numerous other regional local folks that came alongside to help advise the effort. So this actually, as you can see in the URL up here, actually lives in the Adaptation Clearinghouse. So it's a sort of an integrated planning guidance for doing coastal resilience planning at the local level, while also thinking about how to tie into other federal planning efforts, federal requirements around the local hazard mitigation plan. I know Luann was on the video earlier. I know that they were pretty involved and have spoken to the value and utility of this kind of guidance as well. So we really have, encouraged folks to take a look at this, to test drive it. I'm just going to quickly click through some of the screens here. There's ideas about how do we even begin. There's crosswalk ideas for where you crosswalk to different plans, the role of different plans, and how to do that effectively. There's even a there is help screen, which what I really like about this is some of the folks, and Antara, Nikki, and others actually updated the Compass tool to align with the different phases in the adaptation planning guide. So as you're thinking about resources, thinking about how to crosswalk the different guidance that's out there, someone's done the hard work already of thinking through how do you point people to what guidance to use at different phases of the adaptation planning process. So I could go on, but I think what I'll do is just stop there and let folks ask some great questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Eric. And thank you to all of our presenters here. We'll have a virtual round of applause, but thank you, great info. Part of our lean and mean approach here at BayCAN is to throw a lot of info out and see what sticks with you. You can choose. It kind of comes from the learner themselves. what do you want to know more about, and then you can follow up with that. So we've thrown a lot of stuff out today. Let's get to some of your questions, and a couple to start with. David Bihar is monitoring the chat function, so I'll bring him in a second, but let's start with one that came from Mindy's presentation, and kind of two parts to our panel. How are you bringing community members? What's important for bringing community members in? And some of you have touched on this, but say again, what's most important there? What's working? And also elected officials. How are you involving both of those groups in what can be a somewhat arcane process or processes here? So any of our panel members jump in with an answer there. Tiffany, what have you? What can you do in Santa Cruz on that?
Yeah, it was the question, you had cut out a moment, was the question about leadership and the public communities?
Both about engaging the public and about engaging your elected officials. Any tips for people on how?
Yeah, so we had a technical advisory committee that had 2 city council members on our project team, on the technical advisory committee. They happened to be the mayor and vice mayor, and that has been great. We also, on a quarterly basis, or more frequently, went and presented to our city council just to give them an update, and in some cases to get a blessing on approach. In terms of engagement, you know, it really, we've used a variety of traditional engagement tools, also a lot of one-on-one work, particularly with our historically underrepresented folks, and kind of making sure to kind of circle back with them, not ask too much time, but make sure that they're still kind of engaged in the process. So I would say a real mix of experimenting and iterating with more novel techniques, and then a mix of traditional techniques, and really working with our communications manager to utilize all media outlets to promote these kinds of opportunities.
Great. What about Watsonville? Jackie, we just heard from you. How are you keeping elected officials in the game here, and how important is that as you go through the process?
So great question. And actually, I'll have to say our electeds are the one who pushed this button. So our current mayor was the one that triggered us starting a more, I would say, progressive and accelerated climate action and adaptation. We actually have calls with the main project team and the main project lead on the phone, I think quarterly at this point, if not more often, with our mayor reaching out to us and checking on our progress and our implementation deadlines. So City Council is directing us and very involved. With the community, we actually are using multiple techniques, which I would lean on Harris to describe how we're using those. But our community is getting more involved. We actually have a few nonprofits down here. Regeneration is one of them that is helping us lead the way with the younger group. But we have politicians involved. We have all of Public Works involved and our planning team. So
great, excellent. Hillary, what about San Mateo on elected officials and keeping, you know, your bosses in the groove here with what you're doing?
Yeah, we're thinking about having elected officials participate in the committees that we're hoping to set up, so that they're involved and able to hear both the feedback from community members and CBOs throughout the process. It's been how it was arranged in the recovery initiative so far, but we're still in the beginning phases of thinking through who might be interested in participating and how we arrange that. We have had early conversations with Supervisor Pine from the county, who is kind of our champion on this issue, so to get his feedback on the process. So he'll probably be one of helping us guide the process.
Great. Let me bring in David Bihar, who's our chair of BayCAN. David, you've been monitoring the chat function. You got a couple of questions for the group?
Can you hear me now?
You're on mute. There you are. Yeah.
Okay, so I had 2 mutes. I had to mute both of them. So great amount of information. There was a question that was asked about interface with the Coastal Commission and their guidance on I think it refers to sea level rise specifically. For those who are working on LCPs or have gotten them adopted, how was the interface with the Coastal Commission? Did their guidance in any way constrain your options or raise public concerns about in ways that came up in the process? So I think we had a few people talk about LCPs in process or completed. So that for those folks.
Tiffany?
So yes, there are some things in the guidance that are either challenging for our public or conflicts with some of our other planning documents. We have been able to really overcome the public concern through the adaptation pathways approach, quite honestly. Folks say that really makes sense, that we changes these trigger and exceed the folds, kind of calming our community on these things that they might be reluctant
Tiffany, sorry to
I
interrupt.
should say we are working super, yes.
The last sentence was really interesting, but it was distorted through technological issues. Can you say it again? I'm sorry. You were saying that you were able to overcome in some way, and then you kind of cut out. I want to ask you to repeat your last 20 words. Sorry.
Sorry, I got booted out and got back in. I'm sorry about that. I was just going to say that we've worked really closely with the Coastal Commission. A lot of the stuff that we're doing, our local folks haven't done before. And the adaptation pathways approach is really what's helping us with the public. That's what I had mentioned before, that it really makes sense to our public that the use of triggers and thresholds gives them some degree of comfort over, we're not just trying to force these changes, you know, or the Coastal Commission isn't trying to force these changes unless we experience the triggers that we have identified.
So let me follow up then a little bit. So Pathways was an approach that the commission responded to well, that gave you the kind of flexibility for short-term, someone else, I think it was Hermosa maybe, versus long-term measures, you know, sketching them out in a long-term kind of way that provides the opportunity for adaptation of your adaptation measures over time. And the commission was good with that. They handled that well.
Yeah, well, we haven't gone in front of the commission yet, but our local commission staff are very supportive of the approach. We won't be going in front of the commission until the beginning of 2021. We just finished all of our technical work and we're now translating that into policy that will go into the LCP, and it'll be done by the end of the year.
Are you having, I'm going to follow up again, sorry, Bruce, are you having conversations with staff in advance of getting into that formal level about adaptation pathways, and how has how have those conversations gone?
Yeah, we've been working very, very closely with them, and our adaptation pathways approach has been from the start. So they've been involved in the evolution of, you know, what that's looked like to operationalize adaptation pathways. What's not entirely clear, as I mentioned in my presentation, is where the triggers will live in the LCP, if they live there at all, because they might be too specific. So we actually have a meeting tomorrow to sort that out and some of the finer details of, you know, what is all of this going to look like, and, you know, what exactly are the follow-on plans that need to happen. And we've been talking quite a bit about alignment.
Really interesting. Thank you. Bruce, did you want to pipe in, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I want to ask, and we've got 6 minutes left, so I'd like to ask our panelists each to weigh in on this one. Take your current hat off for a second. This whole webinar and the work that you're doing is great, in that you're trying to make this all work with these different plan requirements and these different timelines and different data and all. Let's step back for a second. If you were czar here, would you be interested in moving us over the next few years in California towards one plan for this, as opposed to trying to make it work with 2 or 3 or 4 different planning processes. So let me ask Hillary first. And, you know, this is off the record here, so go ahead.
Yeah, I think part of the reason why we haven't solidified our approach is because we've been trying to see how we can make it work with one plan. Yes, so I think if we, for me, it feels like the plan is a means to get change done, to get the policies passed, to get the projects built, to, you know, educate on solutions that everyone can take. And so I think if we can simplify the planning process, the better. But it's complicated. So I think if you try to put too much in a plan, then it can take forever to get that done too. So
Sure.
Yeah, it can be.
Thanks. Dana, what do you think?
I mean, I definitely think that the vulnerability assessment or risk assessment, that can all be one plan. There was a great plan in New York City called Risk Landscapes. And I think that was a great model that we looked at a lot. I think one of the challenges is differing timelines that things are on, and also differing timelines for updates. So I think that would be some complex schedule that people would have to maintain. And then, you know, pieces would get updated at different times. But that's why I'm such a fan of this sort of really underlying body of data that gets updated on a regular basis that then can be used as needed.
Mindy, what about you and all of your experience in working with various cities and counties? Do you think eventually one plan would be a better approach and we'd get more done?
I think what I'm going to tag off of what something Tiffany said, which and kind of on this idea of a hierarchy. I think we need to have one overarching plan that has land use, climate, and adaptation together. What we don't need is a laundry list of 120 strategies that never get implemented. But then we do need project specific plans. So I think there's kind of this in between, which is we need an overarching guidance about what are we doing with our land use? How are we dealing with green space, infrastructure? But then we need to have like, okay, now we're gonna get that done. So can we create a better hierarchy that is easier to do and better to engage the community? Because they're so confused. I'm working right now in Santa Barbara County, and there are literally 8 different planning efforts going on at the same time that we're trying to engage the community on. It's overwhelming for them. So if we can make this a lot clearer, a lot simpler, I think it's going to be easier to both maintain them, implement them, and actually see action.
Great. What about Watsonville? You all are doing a very good job, it looks like, to integrate, but would it be better eventually could you get more done with one plan that was kind of integrated? Jackie or anyone else?
I will speak as a municipal person, and maybe Harris will have the other side of it. Or Michael and Carolyn, apologies. I think for myself, as someone who has to implement those projects and report on them on a 5-year basis or a 2-year basis or whatever all of these metrics are for milestone reporting, having one plan to report on is super important. In Public Works, we are the implementers. We take your plans and we put those projects in the ground. So there needs to be that connection between your planning department and Public Works of, is it feasible, is it possible, and what your time frame is. And if I didn't have variable timelines for FEMA, for state, for local, it would be so much easier for me not to focus on strategy reporting and actual implementation. Because I think as planners and as Public Works people, we want to see these projects go on the ground and actually make a difference.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Michael.
So from my perspective, you know, when I was at OPR, we were trying to struggle with, you know, how do we integrate these plans? And what we found was really the statutory changes that would be needed would require legislation. And I think it's a meaningful initiative for a select group of people to engage in to help create alignment through statutory changes. I know Eric's probably frowning over there as our OPR rep on the call, but I think one of the specific things to Watsonville to consider in how their plans are structured is a lot of it was driven by funding. So one piece was initiated by a certain funding source, another by another funding source, and another by another funding source. So if you have a one plan strategy, there also has to be really focused funding to make sure that one plan strategy can actually be funded. Otherwise, we wind up in a situation like with general plans that are really old. They don't have enough money to update them. For those jurisdictions that don't have general plan update fees on development, they piecemeal the updates, and you never get this collective, holistic update to reflect climate.
Good. Thank you, Michael. We're going to leave it there. We're at noon, and one of our other rules, other than lean and mean and throwing a lot at you, is we end on time. So thank you for being with us, especially under these circumstances today. We will follow up with the link to the recording. We will follow up with emails of the panelists so that you can talk with them individually. We'll try not to overwhelm them. We'll also follow up with a copy for you of the text file from the chat box. So you can see the conversation and the questions that are going on there and some of the links to documents that were referred to here. So again, thank you very much. From BayCAN, this is Bruce Reardon signing off for
Bruce,
the webinar.
can I just, before you sign off, sorry, I know you want to end this, but Michael ended it with a really good point. This is Michael Barber from San Mateo County with Supervisor Pine. It's really vital for the state to bring all this together because the local communities can't do this on their own. I just want to end it there. Michael hit it. So that is key to this whole conversation.
Thank you, Michael Barber. Thank you all for that, and good note to end on. There'll be more on this, particularly on this last question, and we'll do more as we go to try to help you manage in the current system, because that current system isn't going to change anytime quite too soon. Thank you, and be safe, everyone. Be healthy.
Thanks.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thanks all.